Welcome back to our Overview of God's Plan for Me class. The lesson that we're going to be covering today will actually be the first in a three-part series of lessons this week regarding the names given to the Lord's church in Scripture. And we're going to go over these names because, number one, it relates back to our lessons about identifying the church of the Bible. If it doesn't wear the name of the church of the Bible, that's one of the parts of the organization of it and the description of it. But we also recognize the importance of names in our day-to-day lives. We notice that, generally, it's not okay to call things by the wrong name. Imagine, for example, a wife who just wanted to start wearing the last name of her husband's best friend. That's probably going to raise some eyebrows, and it's probably going to end a friendship if that's my wife. Why wouldn't this apply when it comes to the Lord's church? If He gives it a name, wouldn't it seem to be insulting for us to reject that name in light of some other name that we prefer? However, this isn't the primary reason that I want us to study these names that are given to the Lord's church in Scripture in these series of lessons. The main idea behind these lessons is that generally names are tied to ideas. Think, for example, about names like Karl Marx or Charles Darwin. These are the names of men, but their names conjure up thoughts associated with belief systems. When we think about Karl Marx, we think about Marxism, which would give birth to communism. When we think about Charles Darwin, we think about Darwinism or naturalism or evolution, because he was one of the founding fathers, we might say, of that theory. What we're going to see in the course of these lessons is that this idea of names is true of the names of the church of the Bible as well. Every name that's given to the church in the Bible that we're going to notice has specific ideas tied to it. And these ideas describe the church. And if we want to be the church, if we want to be a part of the church, then these ideas, they have to describe us because we make up the church. That's the focus of our lessons in this series. With that in mind, let us turn our attention to this study. The church is mentioned or given some kind of name at least 113 times throughout the New Testament. Of these 113 times the church is named, 96 times, an overwhelming majority, it is simply called the church. That is the most common name given to the church in Scripture. In fact, 17 out of the 27 New Testament books use the name the church. If this is by a wide margin, such a wide margin, the most common name given to the church, then surely there is something that we can learn from it. So just what is there to know about the church? Well, the first question we will ask ourselves is that question exactly. What can we learn just from the name the church? Well, as we look to the original Greek language from which the New Testament was translated, there is only ever one Greek word from which the word church is translated in the New Testament. And that Greek word is the Greek word ekklesia. Every time the word church occurs in the New Testament, it is translated from the Greek word ekklesia. However, not every time the word ekklesia appears in the New Testament is it translated church. Every time we read church, it comes from the word ekklesia, but every time we read ekklesia in the New Testament, it wasn't always translated as the word church. It was also translated as the word assembly. In Acts chapter 19, verse 32, verse 39, and verse 41, we read the word assembly in all of those verses. The word assembly is actually more true to the definition of the word ekklesia in Greek. That word in the Greek language means a gathering of citizens called out from their homes into some public place, or an assembly. The Greeks used this word to describe a body of citizens gathered together to discuss the affairs of the state. And it was also used to describe a group of people assembled by chance or tumultuously. This is the application in Acts 19, 32, 39, and 41 when we see basically a riot form. That group of people formed to riot were referred to with this Greek word ekklesia, meaning assembly. Interestingly, This word is used to describe the Israelites in the wilderness in Acts 7 and verse 38, and the King James Version translators actually translated it as church there, though most other translations use the word congregation, but it was because there was an assembly there. And from these descriptions, these definitions, we can see how this word would come to describe Christians, because Christians often assembled for various purposes. Going back to verses we've referenced before in Acts chapter 2, 44 through 46, we see that the Christians, they basically assembled daily, continuing in all these things that the apostles taught them to do. They were together having fellowship all the time. But the Greek-speaking world would not formally associate ecclesia, or assembly, with Christianity until the first century. And when they did, this term meant nothing more than assembly, an assembly of people, when it was applied to the first century Christian gatherings. In this regard, the word would come to describe an assembly of Christians gathered for worship, as well as a company of Christians anywhere united in one body, and the whole body of Christians scattered throughout the earth collectively, all who worship and honor God and Christ in whatever place they may be. Now that's a long definition, and there's a lot to consider in that definition. But it can perhaps be summarized best by saying that the word for assembly in Greek, ekklesia, it simply came to mean an assembly of Christians, a group of Christians, anywhere, anytime. Given these definitions of this Greek word meaning assembly, we may be asking ourselves the question, well, where did the word church even come from if the meaning of this word is assembly? Well, with most words in Scripture, most words that we have translated from Scripture, they are translated to the closest equivalent English word which best conveys their Greek meaning. And in some cases, when a suitable English word doesn't exist, the Greek word will be transliterated and invent a new English word. The English word baptism is an example of this because it was transliterated from the Greek word baptizo, because there wasn't a word which fully conveyed the meaning of baptism, an immersion and a rising up in the English language. Yet, this word, ekklesia, it wasn't translated as assembly when reference to the church, as the definition would suggest, nor was it transliterated as some form of ecclesia, as it actually is seemingly in the Spanish language with the iglesia, nor was it transliterated from the Greek word ecclesia in the translation process. So where do we even get the word church from? Well, in looking up an answer to that question, we find that it's a difficult question to answer, but it's a very interesting question to answer. Generally, most sources indicate the word ties back to the Old English word circe, meaning a place of assemblage set aside for Christian worship, the body of Christian believers, Christians collectively, ecclesiastical authority, or power. This would have been the word associated with Christian meeting places around the time the King James translators did their work in 1611. But this is a word that had already become associated with Christianity and assemblies and meeting places before it was ever translated. Thus, its roots actually trace back even farther. We have to look even farther into the past. And that Old English word, what we find is it's most likely derived from an Old German word, which is most likely derived from an Old Greek word, which was kurikon doma, which in Greek means Lord's house. So when the King James Version translators came across the word ecclesia in reference to the assembly of Christians, they simply went with the word which they had come to use for such an assembly, rather than translating it with a more accurate definition of the word. So there's actually evidence that the church, as early as the 1st or 2nd century, when Koine Greek, when the Greek of the New Testament was still commonly spoken, they had already begun to refer to the buildings and the places in which they worshiped in a reverential manner as the Lord's house. Note that this is a practice that's not actually condoned in Scripture. So as we think about this name, the church, remember that by definition, the church is those who make up the assembly. And when we think about people referring to the physical place where Christians assemble as a church or as the assembly itself, this practice could have very easily developed right alongside the practice of creating ornate, pretty buildings for the assembly. We see that in secular history happening along that same time. And why I bring that up is this practice can very easily remove focus from the spiritual nature of the church and turn it to the physical nature of man, the carnal nature of man that's described in 1 Corinthians 3, 1 through 3. We have to remember that the church is a spiritual kingdom made up of people focused on fighting a spiritual battle. This is described in 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5. If we allow ourselves to become so consumed by events in this world that we begin to alienate the people that we're supposed to be saving, we begin to place reverence on the buildings and physical places that we assemble, we've lost focus on what the true nature of the church is. We've lost focus on what our true nature is supposed to be, and being a spiritual assembly of Christians that make up the church. But as we go along with this idea, we continue to see what we can learn from the name, the church, the principle of the church. What else can we learn from it? Well, now that we've established where the name, the church, could have even came from in English, we return to the use of the name the church in Scripture. Like we said, it is called the church at least 96 times in Scripture. Sometimes it's just called the church, as it is in Acts 2 and verse 47. Sometimes it's just called the church at a place, as it's used in Acts 8 and verse 1 to describe the church in Jerusalem. This fits in line with the local and universal definitions that we discussed earlier. Remember, it can refer to a group of Christians assembled in one place, or it can refer to the church universal. It can refer to Christians around the world as the church. What this name does is it brings specificity to the church and to its doctrine. This is through the use of the word "the." When we think about the word "the," we may think it's just a small, insignificant word, but there's actually some very important implications behind the word. You see, the word "the" is a definite article. And without getting into English too much, we have definite articles in English and we have indefinite articles. And we understand this, even if we might not refer to them as such, because the difference is talking about the car versus talking about a car. If you are told to go out and get into a car in the parking lot, then which car are you supposed to get into? Well, by the way that's constructed, you could basically pick a car that you wanted to get into. But if you were told to go get into the car, well, that narrows it down to only one car that you're supposed to get into. This is the way the church is described with this name in Scripture. In Acts 2 and verse 47, we read that the Lord added to the church daily such as should be saved. To which church did God add people? Well, did He add them to the one that best fit their preferences, that best fit their beliefs? You know, there's a popular ideology that kind of exists in the religious world today that we go and find a church that fits us. We go to the church of our choice, the church which best allows us to use our talents, the church which makes us feel the best, the church which makes us feel the most welcome. But we didn't see that in the first century. God added these people to the church when they were saved. And He added them to the church which had just been established. So whatever the doctrine of that church was, that was the doctrine that they accepted. Whatever that church taught, that's what they taught. Whatever that church did, that's what they did, because that was the only option. And note that the doctrine that that church received and practiced and believed and taught, it was from Christ and not from man. In Acts 8, verse 1 and verse 3, Saul is leading a persecution against the church. Well, which church is he persecuting? Would this persecution resemble the persecution that was carried out in the 15th through 17th centuries, wherein people who claimed to be Christians were beaten, tortured, and killed by other people who claimed to be Christians over doctrinal differences? Well, no, that wasn't the case at all. You see, Paul was a Jew. We read that in Philippians 3, 4 through 6. He makes it no doubt about it. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. Saul was a Jew. Paul was a Jew. And he was persecuting the only church that existed. In fact, there's no evidence The churches in the first century had the ability to teach their own doctrine, which differed from all other doctrines. In fact, there is scriptural evidence, scriptural proof, that the church went to great lengths to be sure they were all teaching the same doctrine. That would be the doctrine that Christ gave to them. In Galatians chapter 1, in the first chapter, Paul writes a letter to the churches of Galatia, a region wherein several churches, several congregations existed. And he reveals the reason for writing this letter in verses 6 through 9. There, he says that he is basically disappointed that the Galatians have been so soon removed from the doctrine of Jesus Christ into another doctrine, which was not the doctrine of Christ, but was a false doctrine. And he says that in those verses, if anyone delivered any doctrine to them which was not according to the doctrine which they had already received, the doctrine of Christ, even if an angel from heaven preached that doctrine to them, they were to reject that doctrine and cut those people off, put them away, have nothing to do with them. That is the attitude that the first century church had towards any other doctrines being taught. There was only the one. And what had happened was that the churches in Galatia had begun to believe and teach a doctrine that was different than the first doctrine that they had learned. Now this is interesting, and it's very important for us to understand, because there's a popular way of thinking in the world, a popular ideology in the world, that the church, in a universal sense, refers to the overall group of denominations in the world, and that they all are acceptable so long as the people in them genuinely believe and practice what they believe. And y'all, I wish so badly that that was correct. I wish so badly that that was true. But looking at what we see there in Galatians and in other places, can we honestly say, and be honest when you ask yourself this question, is that what the church in the first century looked like? A large umbrella of different churches teaching different doctrines? Well, it didn't look like that, did it? We have here a group of believers that had a formalized system of doctrine. They met faithfully. There's no evidence that they were doing anything bad. And in fact, there's no indication that Paul believed the Galatians not to be genuine. In fact, he goes so far as to say in chapter 3 that if it was possible, they would have plucked their own eyes out and gave them to Paul if it would have helped him. That's how good the people of the church at Galatia were, how genuine and sincere they were. But their genuineness and their sincere belief of their doctrine did not make their doctrine acceptable. In fact, it left them in a position where their souls were condemned to hell. In Galatians 5 and verse 4, Paul tells them, those of you who have rejected the doctrine of Christ, those of you who have believed this doctrine, that Christ is become of no effect unto you. You are fallen from grace. What's the effect that Christ has on us? It's salvation. What does Christ's grace do for us? It allows us to be saved. If we lose that, what state are we in? We're in a state of damnation. That's what happens if we think we can have a doctrine different than the doctrine of the Bible, a doctrine different than the church of the Bible. If we apply this example to the first century church to the modern religious landscape, and we consider the letter to the Galatian church, y'all, there is no way that all the religious institutions in the world can be what was called the church in Scripture, no matter how badly we want it to. So in the first century, there was one church, a church with a common beginning in Acts chapter 2, a church with a common doctrine detailed throughout the New Testament. Thus, this name, the church, was more than sufficient in the first century to describe the body of saved believers. This is why it was used. But imagine using this terminology today. There would be great confusion if we use this term today. If somebody asked me, where do I go to church? Now, I'm a member of the Church of Christ at Hamilton, Church of Christ in Hamilton, Mississippi. But imagine if someone walked up to me and asked, where do you go to church? And I just said, I go to the church at Hamilton. I'm a member of the church at Hamilton. What would be their response? Well, if they were familiar with the landscape there in Hamilton, Mississippi, they would know that there are about 6 or 7 different religious institutions claiming to be a church just there in Hamilton, Mississippi, a town of only 300 or 400 people. So they wouldn't have a clue where I went to church if I used this terminology today. Yet this was common in the first century. It's how they talked in the first century. They just said, I'm a member of the church, and everybody knew which church they were talking about. What does that tell us? It tells us that the religious landscape today doesn't match the religious landscape of the first century, at least in terms of Christianity. And it tells us that we who are Christians have got some major work to do. Imagine how effective Christianity could be if we return to this concept, return to a concept where we could say we were a member of the church and people knew what we were talking about because there was only one church. Y'all, unity is what we would have, and unity brings about strength. Ecclesiastes 4, 9 through 12 describes that in beautiful poetic language in Hebrew, saying that 2 are stronger than 1, and if one fall, the other one can pick him up. We are stronger together. Imagine if all of Christianity was united. Imagine what we could do if we weren't debating one another because we all looked to the Bible as our standard and we agreed on it as our standard. No wonder Paul, through inspiration, would so harshly condemn division in the Corinthian church. 1 Corinthians 1, 10 through 13, the first thing Paul addresses is the fact that there are divisions in the Corinthian church. And this warning came during a time when there was still only one church, as we mentioned. But what Paul wanted to do there was nip the problem in the bud, because he knew how harmful, how terrible that division could become if it festered and led to more and more division. Y'all, that's what's happened in the religious world. We have allowed ourselves to become divided, and people do not rally at the truth anymore. Y'all, when 2 people disagree about the truth, someone is always wrong. And it may be both. And how tragic it is to be divided against the truth. The church in the first century was united. And because of that, it was able to spread the gospel throughout the entire known world. If we wish to accomplish that same goal today, then we have to strive to be the church that did it in the first century. A church that was united in doctrine and in practice. So what can we learn from the name The Church? Well, we first learn that this name emphasizes that the church is us, and we've got to make sure that we do our part to focus on the spiritual nature of the church. Secondly, we learn that the church was unique in the first century and that there was only one. And if we want to be a part of the saved, then according to Acts 2 and verse 47, that we must be a part of the church. Thank you.